Alright guys, today I'm going to be working on the S2000. We got some parts that we're going to install. So let me go ahead and get my GSF out of the way and we'll get working on the S2000. Alright, now we got that out of the way, we can get started on the S2000. This is my 2005 Honda S2000 with a AMG Design MSR wide body. Also has a FullBlown Motorsports turbo kit. Alright, so I'm going to get started putting this thing on the lift. We're going to get the pull the radiator out and start working on the intake manifold and pulling the head to put my new valves in. Alright, so here's all the stuff that I'm going to be installing on the S2000. We have our FullBlown Motorsports intake manifold with all the hoses and fittings. Then I have my new radiator hoses. These are custom made by AMG Fuel and Design. They have red clamshell type clamps on them. And they're going to mate up with this really nice water neck that's going to go on the shock tower. And then the thermostat housings for the block. And then I also have these two fittings that'll get welded onto my radiator. And finally, Chasing J's radiator, titanium radiator cap to go on the fuel neck, or the coolant neck for the shock tower. Then, while I already have everything apart, I have brand new Ferrea intake and exhaust valves, dual valve springs with valve seals, titanium retainers, and dual spring bases. Now, you already have to pull the intake manifold to pull the head, and changing out the radiator hoses and thermostat housings and all that is a lot easier to do with the intake manifold off. So I figured that this would be a really good video to do and just do all of it at the same time. So I'm going to break this video up into two parts. First will be the intake manifold install and the radiator hoses. And then the second part will be installing the valves and the retainers, springs, bases, all that. It'll also show you how to properly grind your valves to the seats so that you don't have any valve leaking, and how to properly remove valve seals, bases, how to remove your keepers from the valve and everything like that. So let's go ahead and get started, get the car on the lift, get the coolant drained, and start on the intake manifold. Alright, so a couple other things I'm going to recommend that you get. This is a must. It doesn't have to be OEM, but I would highly recommend OEM. This is a head gasket set for the S2000. Comes with a head gasket, all new valve cover, exhaust intake manifold, tube seals, VTEC solenoid, all your O-rings. There's the OEM Honda part number, so you can get the exact correct one. And then I'd recommend getting a brand new oil drain bucket. If you plan to reuse your coolant. I went ahead and took this one inside the house and rinsed it out with water because there were some plastic shavings in there from when the holes were drilled. So just get you a brand new one so that you can drain your coolant into it and then just put it right back in the car. Or if your coolant's old and dirty, you can just go ahead and replace it. Let's get this pan on my roll cart and we'll go ahead and get the coolant drained out. For those of y'all that were wondering what I was doing down here, I cut out a little piece of a bottle and kind of taped it up here underneath the drain plug for the radiator so that it doesn't get all over my splitter when I drain the coolant. And just kind of taped it to the bottom here, but it should work. We'll see. Alright, I want to give y'all an idea of what my radiator hoses are going to look like when they're done. So you got this mount that's attached to the shock tower. Got the nice Chasing Chase cap with the clamshell clamps. And that's going to go back underneath the motor. And then this is going to attach up here at the radiator. That's going to go just like that. So right now I'm trying to decide if I want to run my catch can lines over across the top. Schmuck is coming out with a new catch can to go on the passenger side right here in this corner, so I think I might get that and then run my catch can lines back along the firewall and into that new can, and we'll just get rid of this one. That way it won't cover up the new hoses. And this does look kind of cool from this angle, but from the front where most people are looking at it, I don't think it looks as good. So probably end up going that route. But anyway, let's finish getting the radiator out, and I'm gonna take the radiator down to go have the fittings welded onto it. got the intake manifold off. You can see from the time lapse it was not an easy task. Don't forget to take these two bolts out right here. The bottom, they bolt in from this way. There's also a bolt here, and obviously this bolt here and this bolt here are the most difficult two to get to. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of 1/4 inch extensions with swivels. Make sure that you tape your swivels this is what I used right here. It's a 12mm shallow socket with a universal joint and then just a couple extensions. I taped up all the joints because otherwise you will drop your sockets. It's very tight fit, but I was able to get them all with that one tool. Let me take you over to the intake manifold. Alright, so we got the intake manifold here. You can see those were the two bolts that I was talking about here, and this one here. And then you also have one here that holds a bunch of hoses and stuff like that. You can see that there is not a lot of room around these two bolt holes, so they're a pain to get out. Also, these two bolts are a pain to get out for this water neck housing, so that one in particular. But once you get the manifold off, you can kind of pick it up and tilt it up, and then you can be able to get to that. This one's easy, this one's a pain to get to. And then don't forget to unplug your sensor here. But that's pretty much it for the intake manifold. I'm going to go ahead and start transferring over all this stuff. This is your intake air temperature sensor, and then your map sensor, your idle air control valve, and then the throttle body itself, and your coolant temperature sensor. So I'm going to need to transfer over these studs for the fuel rail to sit on, these little bungs here for my injectors, and then like little stuff like this, these little fittings here, those are going to have to get transferred over. Just unbolt this from here. This bracket for the throttle cable is going to need to be transferred over unless you have a 06 to 09. And then just all these hoses and stuff like that. The nice thing is with the new intake manifold, your idle air control valve, your intake air temperature sensor, and all of your vacuum fittings are on the bottom. And here's your bracket for where your throttle cable goes. But it's just nice that they kind of hid everything up out of the way. Here's where your coolant temperature sensor goes. And then you have your factory little fitting here to bleed the coolant. All your injector connections here. And then your coolant line for to run through the throttle body. So I'm going to go ahead and get both intake manifolds set up side by side, and we'll go ahead and start swapping everything from one to the other. You can just go ahead and replace these with bolts, but I want to keep my titanium nuts, so I'm going to go ahead and remove these studs. What you're going to want to do is put 2 nuts on there and lock them together, and then once they're locked together, you can just take a wrench and unscrew the nuts. And then your stud comes off. Alright, and there you have it, guys. Got the new studs put in with my titanium nuts on there. And you can see how the intake manifold fits in there. Fits really nice. I did go ahead and bend this heater hose pipe back a little bit. I just took a 2x4 and rested it on the clamp and lightly tapped it with a hammer. That just gave me a little bit more clearance. It didn't need to be done, but I just like to have that room to get the manifold in there. And then you do have to remove the 2 metal brackets down in here. Let me pull the intake back off and I'll show you all the things you need to remove. Alright, got the manifold back off. There's a bracket that sits right here. I had to take the drive belt off, remove the top bolt out of the alternator and loosen the bottom one, and then you'll just slide the alternator out of the way. Remove this bolt and this bolt here. You want to make sure and put this bolt back in because this one actually goes into the block to hold this tensioner bracket. This one is just for the bracket. So you have the 2 bolts that go into the bottom of the manifold here, and then the bolts in here. And then the second is down here and bolts to the block right there. It's much easier to get to from the bottom, but it's just a bracket that sits right here that bolts to the back side of the intake manifold. Both of those brackets are going to have to be removed to be able to fit the intake manifold in. And then next thing we're going to do is get all these vacuum lines run, and we're going to tie those into the bottom of the manifold. So I'm actually going to remove this T piece here, and I'm just going to connect this hose directly to the bottom of the intake manifold. You can just go ahead and plug this if you want to. This is just for evap, so if your car is turboed and if you're running a standalone ECU, you're just not going to need that anymore. But I'm just going to go ahead and connect it just for the hell of it. Then the other line that we need to connect, this is for my blow-off valve here, my catch can, which runs down into here, and then it also ties in for my hob switch to kick on my secondary fuel pump. So all I'm going to have to do is attach an AN fitting to this hose, and then we'll just screw it into the bottom of the intake manifold. And then also we're going to have to do our vacuum line for our brake booster. So this is going to have to get tied in. I'm going to have to extend this hose to reach the bottom of the intake manifold, and we'll get that all connected. Alright, whenever you're installing these fittings, you're going to want to make sure that you use either Teflon tape or what I have here. This is thread sealant with PTFE. It's basically the same thing as Teflon tape, just in liquid form. So I'm going to apply this to all the threads and then put those all in the intake manifold here.